All right, perfect. So thank you all for coming to the first Zoom class of the new year. So for the next few months, we are going to be focusing on trees. We're going to be basically doing a different tree genus a month. This month, we're going to be focusing on maples. In particular, we're focusing on the native maple species that are found here in Kentucky. So that's going to be what we kind of focus in on today. So thank you again for coming. So let's go ahead and get started. So some of you may have seen this before for some of my other tree talks, but since we are going to be talking about trees, I think it would be good to give an overview on some tree facts for Kentucky. So in our great state of Kentucky, hardwood forests are going to cover over 50% of the area. This is about 12.4 million acres of forest. So we are a pretty well substantially forested area, especially when you go out into eastern Kentucky. But even parts of Hopkins County itself are pretty heavily forested. We've got about over 120 native tree species in Kentucky, primarily dominated by oak and hickory. And those are tree species that we're going to talk about in future months. But we have about 20 different oak species and 10 different hickory species. So they make up the primary forest type, which is about 75% of the area. Now, something that we are going to talk about today, though, is one of our more common tree species on an individual level is our red maple, which makes up about 12% of all trees in Kentucky. So if you think you see a lot of red maple, well, there is a reason for that. So just some great resources for you. Um, when it comes to especially focusing on native plants, I'll just kind of run through this list real quick because everyone always asks, like, where do you find more information? So we have a Kentucky Native Plant Society. We have states close to us with similar native plants that have some good information, like Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Finder always has great information. Wildflower.org, even though it's wildflower, they focus on trees and shrubs too. North Carolina Extension has a great plant database. Arbor Day Foundation is always a great resource for trees. And then here at the University of Kentucky, our horticulture department, as well as our forestry and natural resources department, has some great resources too that you can look on their website for publications for. And then we also have our State Division of Forestry as well. Now, those are kind of more websites. When it comes to things like resources, like books, so of course there are plenty of pocket guides that you can get out there. But a book of mine that's my favorite is The Tree and Shrubs of Kentucky, which is Mary E. Wharton and Roger Barber. So that book guide was written back in the 70s, but honestly, it still has a lot of great information. It's kind of my go-to tree resource, in all honesty. Now, some of the scientific names may have changed a little bit within 50 years, which is understandable, but the information that they do have, especially mentioning, the particular characteristics with how to classify this maple versus another maple or an oak versus another oak is really helpful information. So that's a great guide. If you need something a little bit smaller, especially if you're on trails and you don't want to haul around a huge book, the Tree Finder book is a great little pocket guide. It's a dichotomous key of sorts to help you with identifying different trees here, especially in the eastern United States. So definitely look at these guides as helpful tools for you, especially when you are out in the woods and you're not really sure what tree is what. So let's focus in on the maple group today. So in particular, we're talking about the Acer genus. Now, I will say a lot of changes go on in botany that you're going to see maples potentially being switched over. Of course, the family has kind of gone back and forth with maples, and then even the genus may potentially be changing too. We won't kind of go into that too much today, but I will say in general, with maples, we're particularly talking about that Acer genus, and that is usually categorized in the soapberry family. You may have heard of the soapberry family just because the name is interesting, where a lot of the berries in this family were used in cosmetics or used to make into soaps because it makes a really great lather. So it's kind of been pushed into that family of plants. Again, things are kind of changing scientifically. Really what it is, kind of what we talked about in previous classes, is as scientists and botanists go more on a molecular scale, they're able to kind of really categorize plants into whole new families or whole new groupings based on their genome, which really wasn't possible 100 years ago, of course. A lot of our categorizing of plants was done, based on especially their flower components. So we're seeing a lot of changes there. But when it comes to maples, a lot of them do have very common characteristics that helps you identify, oh, this is the maple genus. So, of course, these are hardwood trees that are distributed across North America. We have about 13 different species of maples here in the US, 6 species in Kentucky, and we're going to talk about all 6 of those species today. The ones that we're going to talk about, the red and sugar maples, are going to be the ones that we see most across our Kentucky landscape. When it comes to the physical characteristics, maples do have an opposite leaf arrangement. Most of the time, their leaves are going to be lobed. Now, how heavily lobed or dissected or number of lobes is going to depend on the species that we'll talk about. And then they all have a winged fruit called, in particular, a double samara. And with samaras, they are kind of what we think of as the helicopter seeds, right? That they're just kind of flying around in the air. And a lot of our kiddos really like to play with them as such. And so those are kind of more the specific characteristics there. Now, when it comes to maples, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them have brilliant fall color. They have different types of pigments that are found after the chlorophyll thins out in the fall, different carotenoids, things like that, which helps you produce different beautiful oranges and yellows, and the reds are usually from anthocyanins. Um, so a lot of these maples, in particular the red maple that we'll talk about, has some brilliant fall color. Now, maples and generally they're important for a variety of reasons. So let's look at them from an environmental standpoint. They're an important tree to have in our ecosystem. Why? Because they're a great food source for birds and mammals. So when it comes down to it, the seeds that are produced is eaten by a lot of bird and mammal species. The flowers, although they're pretty insignificant, that we'll talk about and really inconspicuous, those are actually really good for our insects, our bee populations, because they're generally, for the most part, a lot of our maples are early blooming. A lot of times they'll get the flowers on before they get their foliage. And so when nothing else is in bloom, these potentially are late winter into early spring. And so it's a good source for pollinators. They also, as they age, of course, they will create nesting cavities. Of course, these nesting cavities are important for things like wildlife, like small mammals like raccoons and possums will use those nesting cavities, but also owls, woodpeckers, all of those will utilize them. And even the stems, the bark, that is going to be browsed on by our deer populations for good or bad, honestly. But then also for our beaver and rabbit populations as well, we'll utilize them. And just in general, these are good shelter plants for different bird species as well. And these do act as a good host plant for different insect species. So they could be used for the larval caterpillar stage of a moth or butterfly species, and we'll mention one or two of those today. When it comes to humans, they really are an economic importance for the wood products and the maple syrup. So generally, most maples, not all of them, but most of them are made of a hard, durable wood that we use for furniture primarily. So we'll use that in cabinetry and flooring, things of that nature. But then also something that we'll talk about at the end of the class is the importance of maple syrup, which is what we use quite a bit in recipes and cooking. And even back in the day was used for medicinal purposes from our Native American population. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit today as we go into each of the different maples. Okay, so what maples are found in Kentucky? So our Kentucky Woodlands Magazine is a great resource, and they came up with this really nice graph here, this really nice table here, where it lists our maple species and even how you differentiate between them. And we'll kind of talk about those differences too as we go into each one. But when it comes down to it, we've got our sugar maple, red maple, silver maple, our box elder, black maple, and striped maple are our maples, native maple species that are found here in Kentucky. So let's go ahead and get started with talking about each of our different maples. So the first one we're going to talk about is our black maple. Now, this one is not as common as our red or sugar maple. And a lot of times, too, we may accidentally mistake it as a sugar maple just based on the foliage, the kind of lobed leaves. So we do have to kind of watch that. Generally, this tree is going to be about 60 to 80 feet tall with a more rounded crown. Now, something that we'll mention today, some of these maple species that we talk about make really great shade plants and are good for more urban landscapes. Others are not. And I'll kind of explain which ones are not here as we talk about them too. This one will do fairly well as a urban landscape plant. It's a little bit more tolerant of pollution, compaction, things of that nature. So you could use this as a large shade tree, and it has a more, if you will, desirable appearance in the landscape as well. But when it comes to conditions, you want to make sure you're providing it with well-drained, moist soil. A lot of our maples like to have a little bit more moist soil generally, but not to the point where it's so soggy either. You want to make sure that it's not, say in a flood zone all the time. This tree can tolerate full sun to partial shade. Really not full shade. It's not an understory maple species. So just make sure you're providing it with several hours of sunlight a day. As it ages, it does have kind of more of this darker gray bark, and it's a lot more smooth generally than some of the other maple species. And then the twigs themselves are kind of more of a shade of gray or brown. And how you can kind of differentiate this from other maple species is it has these leafy stipules that are at the base of some of those leaf stems. The leaves are generally going to be three-lobed and more of a darker green, not going to be as heavily dissected as some of the other maples. Now, again, with a lot of the flowers, they're pretty inconspicuous. You know, they're really not much to look at generally. They're pretty insignificant. Maples do have male and female flowers. There are actually some trees that have separate male and female trees altogether, which I'll kind of point those out too. Now, this one with the black maple, it's got male and female flowers on the same plant. Generally, they're going to be in the shape of little drooping umbels. They're going to be look very similar to each other, except the female flowers are going to be a little bit shorter in nature. And again, most of these maples, they are going to be flowering early to late spring, just kind of depending on the species. So again, really good for insect pollinators, especially at the beginning of the season. Now with black maple, it does have relatively good fall color, different red, orange, and yellow colorations. So, you know, again, it kind of has that additional aesthetic value to it. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, this is a great tree. Maples are in general for providing shelter, nesting sites. The birds are going to eat the seeds, and different insects will feed off of this plant. Box elder. So box elder, even though we don't call it necessarily a maple, it does kind of also go by the common name ash leaf maple, but most of the time we're all calling it a box elder. But it gets that other nickname, if you will, the ash leaf, because it's the one maple that does not have that lobed leaf. It is more of a pinnately compound leaf form. And generally, it's got leaflets that are 3 to 5 in forms of 3 to 5. And if I'm being honest with you, sometimes people can easily mistake the seedlings for poison ivy, which is understandable. If I'm being honest with you, I initially made that mistake at my house when I first moved there. At first glance, I saw what looked like poison ivy, but then I realized I had a box elder tree in my landscape, and it was, of course, the seeds were getting everywhere, and I'm getting baby box elders all over the place. So in a way, it was a comfort to know that I didn't have poison ivy, but it is also a little bit of a pain with this plant because you will have sprouts everywhere. So be mindful of that. This is the most widespread maple in the United States compared to all of our other species. This is also a smaller maple. It's only going to get about 30 to 50 feet tall. In addition to it setting seed, of course, and actually the samaras that are on it are a little bit more droopy and long in form compared to other ones. This has not as desirable of a form. It doesn't make a really great landscape plant, if you will. It's kind of all over the place with the foliage, and not to mention it will form a lot of sprouts along the trunk. So a lot of people aren't generally planting box elder as an ornamental. In fact, they're trying to get rid of it because they kind of consider it a little bit weedy in nature. Now it does have separate male and female trees. As you can imagine, if the female trees are pollinated, then they're setting off the seeds. And so if you are keeping a box elder for ornamental purposes, more people are going to desire the male plant versus the female plant because the male plant's not producing all those seeds. The foliage, one thing I'll mention, going back to the foliage real quick, is generally that foliage when it's coming out is a very vibrant green color, very bright, almost chartreuse to lime green, if you will. And so that, those little things can kind of help you if you're like, I'm not sure what this is. Is this poison ivy? Is this not? But obviously, also, if you see kind of more that five leaflets or or such, you'll be able to identify that as box elder as well. Um, this is generally fast growing, especially if you get a lot of babies in your yard that they can quickly take over. It is more short-lived though when it comes to other maple species. Other maple species can generally live a few hundred years. This has very weak, brittle wood that honestly, if we have a really bad windstorm, a really bad thunderstorm, it could break pretty easily. And so generally, this is not going to live more than 75 to 100 years. So if you have some on your property, just kind of keep that in mind. Now, these can grow in a wide variety of locations. They do prefer more wet conditions, and mine is actually in a low-lying wet spot of my property. And generally, like in the woodlands, you're going to see this more along the streams, rivers, and ponds. But honestly, it can adapt pretty well. So when it comes to other aspects of the box elder, so really with it being a pretty weak brittle wood, this is not very desirable, especially economically. So we don't really use this wood in any kind of furniture. Really, it's just going to be the pulp might be the yeah, might be used for like making paper or something like that. Um, when it comes to can you extract the sap and make a type of maple syrup from the box elder? And I can't remember if I said it in the black with the black maple, you could use that. But with box elder, you can extract it for syrup. It's called more mountain molasses is the nickname that it gets. It's not as desirable though as extracting from our sugar or our red maples for maple syrup. And again, we'll kind of talk about more of that in a little bit. Something you may also know, I don't have a picture of it on here, is we do have an insect that tends to feed on the seeds of this plant, and that's the box elder bug. You might be familiar with the box elder bug because there can be large populations of them. They're that orangey black color, and sometimes they can be quite a nuisance. But yes, those can be found on this tree as well. All right, let's talk about our red maple, our Acer rubrum, because this is going to be probably our most popular red maple species out there, especially for ornamental purposes. So this is going to be a little bit shorter, not as short as box elder, but a little bit shorter, about 40 to 70 feet tall is about how tall these maples can get. They are a great ornamental species, a great shade tree for your landscape because they can adapt pretty well to a wide range of different soil conditions, um, and full sun to partial shade. I will say one thing that I do see a lot with red maples is especially younger trees within that first 5 to 10 years, they can get quite a bit of cracking along the main trunk. And usually that's due to different temperature fluctuations, like too hot, too cold. And so sometimes we do get a little bit of that cracking. Long term, it could be a little bit of an issue with the tree, may not just be as resilient. But that is something that we notice. Also, something I probably should have mentioned earlier too is that maples in general have very shallow root systems, very superficial root systems. And so if you are going to be incorporating them into your landscape, be mindful of that. You'll probably want to allow a pretty wide area of mulch around that tree, because otherwise you could be hitting those roots with a lawnmower, and that could be hurting the tree and also hurting your lawnmower. So you want to avoid that. So you may want to allow a pretty significant area, maybe to the drip line of the tree, that's kind of mulched around it. Now, this picture is actually a good example. Don't do volcano mulches. You do not want the mulch to be right up against the trunk of the tree, because that can just allow for pests and diseases to easily come on board. And it just helps, it promotes things that we don't want, like root girdling, things of that nature. So, if you're going to be mulching around the tree, it doesn't need to be too deep, about 2 to 3 inches of mulch, and make sure it's spread away from the trunk a couple inches so it's not actually touching it. So be mindful of your mulching, because unfortunately, a lot of people get it wrong and it can be detrimental to the tree. So like I said, beautiful shade tree though. It's going to be relatively fast growing, providing shade within, about 10 to 20 years. Um, and with especially red maple, a lot of people love it because of the foliage. So this primarily has 3 to 5 palmate lobed leaves. Generally, we kind of see more of the three, the number three. They're a little bit smaller of a leaf compared to others. Their flowers, although small, are usually a very vibrant red color, and usually they come out late winter, sometimes earlier and earlier every year. Depending on how warm our winters are, we'll see them blooming in February. But they're these beautiful little red flower clusters that you can kind of see in the picture. And again, a lot of our early insect pollinators are going to be out going to those flowers, which is very important. Um, the leaves, going back to the foliage, um, produces a beautiful fall coloration, anywhere from orange to red colors. And honestly, there's a lot of cultivated varieties of red maple on the market, quite a bit. Things like October sky, autumn sky, or something of that nature. And so a lot of red maples are being hybridized, cultivated to have more of that fall coloration on them, to make them a little bit more desirable for people. And so you'll see that a little bit more. Now, kind of in addition to what I had mentioned with kind of that cracking, these can be prone to some pest and disease issues, especially when we have a really wet year. We may see a lot of fungal leaf spot diseases. Generally, it's not anything to be too concerned with, but if you notice on your maple, kind of like these orangey brown leaf spots, and then you start to notice the whole leaf yellow, die off, drop the leaves early, like the tree itself is defoliating really early, on in the season. That could be due to that fungal disease. Sometimes the fungal disease can cause that premature leaf drop, which of course puts a damper on your fall color, right? That puts a damper on, fall foliage colors. And honestly, we saw quite a bit of that this past year. I noticed that. So again, it's usually not enough to like kill the tree off, cause considerable harm, but it could cause early defoliation and just cause leaf loss. And what you can do is you can rake up those leaves around the tree and remove them. to kind of help prevent any kind of reinfection for next year. Um, and again, I see this on a lot of red maples too, just because even though maples are, and really just any plant, they're bred for a particular purpose. Even sometimes they're bred for more disease resistance. Sometimes they can be a little bit more prone to diseases, especially if the breeder is just focusing in on more aesthetic characteristics. So just kind of be mindful of that. So as with other maple species, great for pollinators, great for wildlife and birds. Um, this is a great host plant for the imperial moth larva. The moth adult itself does not feed on the tree, but the larva, the caterpillars do. So it's an important host plant for that insect. One thing I will mention is this, along with the sugar maple, is kind of the more one of the two maples that's used most frequently when it comes to maple syrup. And honestly, the Native Americans used red maples for the syrup as well as for medicinal purposes too. Even things like using it almost like a cough medicine for colds, flu, that sort of thing. So let's move on from the red maple. Let's talk about the silver maple. And some of you may be relatively familiar with silver maple that's found here. Now, this is kind of more of what we consider a bottomland species. We see this growing along larger rivers. Even though we do see this in the landscape or as a landscape plant, it's not generally grown as much as an ornamental, except, and I'll mention this, is that this species of maple does hybridize very easily with red maples. And so a lot of times you can get particular hybrids that can do relatively well in the landscape. And generally we call that the Freeman maple. So it's a hybrid of red and silver maple. So if you have silver maple, you need to keep this in a wet area. It's not going to perform well on a dry site, and it'll be very short-lived. It's actually a very short-lived maple anyway. Kind of like the box elder, this wood is very weak and breaks easily compared to other maples. This also is not ideal for maple syrup either. So this maple has actually the lowest sugar content of all the maples here in Kentucky. So you really don't want to be extracting sap from here. It's not going to taste as yummy and sweet compared to the other ones. But I will say, with that in mind, the sap was still used to treat ailments by our indigenous cultures. Now, this is a very tall maple. This can get up to 100 feet tall. So this is one of our taller maple species. Has more of a rounded spreading crown, so a little less structured compared to kind of like our red maple and black maple. You can recognize it relatively easy from other maple species because the lobes on the leaves are very deeply cut. They're pretty heavily dissected. This top picture may not do it justice, but that's kind of a young tender leaf coming in. But you can see a little bit of that dissection there. And where it gets its name, and this is kind of really helpful as a factor, is the underside of the leaves have more of a silvery appearance. So they're a little bit more showy, especially in the wind. And I have seen this on a windy day on these trees. You can notice it pretty easily. This also, compared to other maples, has more shaggy bark as it ages. So this is, again, very fast growing. And as it ages, the bark kind of becomes more shaggy in nature compared to the other ones or that are a little bit more smooth. Again, more inconspicuous flowers, and still has the winged samaras. Now this does not have quite the showy fall color that the other maple species do. It's kind of more of a yellow coloration, fall color to it. Um, so if you have that or you have it nearby, it just may not be as splendid as some of the others. Still beautiful, of course, in my opinion. But you know, again, if you're trying to get a maple for the fall color, this is not the maple for you. Okay, striped maple. Striped maple is a really interesting maple species, and it is not one that we see very often. Honestly, we're not really seeing this in West Kentucky. This is occurring at higher elevations. This is occurring more in our Appalachian Mountain Range, okay? So we're looking at Eastern Kentucky. Um, Generally, we're going to find this maple more. So I don't know if anyone really goes out that way, but like we always, Pine Mountain is one of our favorite places to go hiking as a family. And striped maple is found on Pine Mountain as well as Black Mountain out east. So if you all kind of go to those places, you could potentially see it out there. And the reason for that being that they prefer those higher elevations. They like cooler summers. They don't like it as hot. Um, Kind of like a lot of our conifers, honestly, even though it's not a conifer. Um, and so it's not going to adapt well if we try to plant it here. It's just not. It's going to struggle in our summer heat. Um, and honestly, it's going to prefer a little bit more shade, more of a shaded environment too, and kind of more well draining, moist soils. It doesn't adapt well to to compacted soils. It doesn't adapt well to like more urban areas where you have more air pollution. It's just kind of more sensitive to that. So this is going to be a maple species you're going to just see when you go into the woodlands of Eastern Kentucky, honestly, and more of the mountainous regions. So you're going to admire it, you know, along the trail, basically. Um, so when it comes to characteristics, why is it called the striped maple? Well, it's a really interesting characteristic on it because no other maples around here have it. Along the stems and the young trunks, and you can kind of see in this picture here, it has these white striped markings. It's very beautiful and it's very easy um, to notice this, to kind of distinguish this from other tree species. It also goes by the name snake bark because of that. Now, I will say, as this maple ages, it gets older, that coloration is going to fade a little bit more, going to be kind of more brownish as it ages. So you're not going to see that as much in older specimens, but still very beautiful, very vibrant. Um, the leaves also are very interesting on the striped maple. It has what we call a goose foot, and you can kind of see that from the picture. So it has, even though it kind of has that lobed foliage, you can kind of see those three main points that make it look like it's shaped like a goose foot. So it's kind of cute. But again, very easy to distinguish if you see this in the wild. Um, Kind of more, you know, of a rounded growth habit, not as structural though as other maple species. But again, you're not really going to be growing this as an ornamental. Um, the foliage, it does have some yellow fall foliage color, so you can kind of see that from this picture here. So you may be able to distinguish that also, like if you're hiking in the fall months and you see kind of more of that bright yellow color. Um, some other things that I'll mention. with this is not a tree we really extract for syrup either, although it was used to treat, again, a variety of like colds and coughs and things like that. But something interesting, kind of a little fun fact, if you will, was this was a very common tree that was used by our Native Americans to make arrows, compared to other tree species. So just kind of an interesting fact there. All right, let's move on to the sugar maple. So we're leaving the sugar maple for last, just because this is kind of our most prevalent maple in when it comes to importance, I guess, more for economic importance, I suppose. But if you didn't know this, it is the national tree of Canada. So if you're like, oh, I've always noticed a maple on the flag of Canada, but what maple is it? Well, it's the sugar maple, if you didn't know that. Um, when it comes to the maple, generally, it has five lobes, kind of with some more coarse, finely toothed margins on the leaves. This is one of our more slower growing sugar maples. Now we can use this very easily as an ornamental, but it's not going to be so great close to your house. This can get quite tall. Again, slower growing, kind of more spreading, and it's going to grow better in, again, more moist areas. Kind of like what I had mentioned with the striped maple, is this is more prone to issues with soil compaction and urban pollution. So it's going to be a little bit more sensitive to that. So it may not fare as well either in a more urban environment. Although, again, I mean, I do see sugar maple in a lot of our landscapes, whether it was planted there on purpose or not. But this is one of our longer lived sugar maples. It can be live several hundred years, compared to other maple species. As it ages, you do start to see a little bit more ridging along the trunk. The bark becomes more furrowed, if you will, compared to other species. This does have lovely fall colored, anything from your red, orange, and yellows, and you can kind of see that on the picture here. The Samaras, so they are usually found on kind of longer and sometimes more reddish stalks. And of course, the main reason we're talking about sugar maple is it is really the only tree species, if you will, maple species that's used for commercial production, actual commercial production, grown for commercially to make maple syrup. So it is tapped for maple syrup, and this syrup is used for a variety of purposes. Native Americans use this again for medicinal purposes. But you can use the syrup also, you know, for in candies, you know, to put as a beverage. I mean, different things. You could even ferment it, almost like make it into a beer, if you will. It could be used to cook meat. So basically, if you didn't know that, maple syrup could be used for a number of different purposes other than just being put on our pancakes and waffles. Um, but with sugar maple, it's going to have a little bit higher sugar percentage. So kind of with that in mind, let me focus in on the maple syrup. So first of all, you can give a whole class and a whole course to maple syrup production. Not going to go into all of that today. But again, as I had mentioned before, primarily we're using the sap of the sugar and red maples. The sap generally is going to have 1 to 2% sugar content, the highest being 3%. So it's not a very high percentage, but it is enough in that whenever you're boiling the sap, it allows those sugars to caramelize, which creates that brown coloration. And people are not usually adding sugar to this, not like, a white sugar, if you will. Um, you don't need to add that. You actually, whenever you're eating maple syrup in its, natural form, it is still very sweet. Um, because it's boiled down essentially for the right sugar content. Now, the sugar is going to vary depending on tree. Of course, we already mentioned that with the different tree species, but also the age of the tree and also when you're tapping the tree season to season. Also, the age of the tree is important for tapping. We kind of go based on the diameter of the tree, how much you can tap it. So there's kind of this little table here that says that the diameter is 10 to 15 inches, you can only tap it once, whereas the bigger the tree, the older the tree, you can tap it more times. And also generally, if you're tapping the same tree from year to year, you don't want to tap in the same location. You want to move to a different section of the tree. And again, there's whole guides and information on how to tap for maple syrup. And if this is something that you are really interested in, honestly, consider going to one of our Kentucky maple schools. We do offer those across the state every year. This past year, it was in Clark County, but I will say we have had um, uh, in service trainings, we have had maple syrup trainings at our Dawson Springs 4-H camp. Um, I'm not aware of anything really for 2026 yet, but certainly if I find that information, I can give that to you if that is something you're interested in. Even though we kind of think of maple syrup tapping as more of an Eastern Kentucky thing, we do have several people here in Western Kentucky that still do that. So, again, if that's something that interests you, we do have some classes that are offered across the state for that. Um, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Um, let me, before I take questions, let me go ahead and put one more thing up here before I stop recording. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see that. So today we talked about maples. Next month we are going to dive into pines. So we're going to talk about the different pine trees that are native to Kentucky. Some of you may have seen a preview of that when I had my conifer class last month, but we're going to go into more of a deep dive into the different pine species that we see. So February, we're talking about pines. March, we're going to talk about ash trees. And of course, you can't talk about ash trees without talking about the invasive insect, the emerald ash borer. So we'll go into that. April, we're going to focus on oaks. And then May, we're going to finish up with hickories. So be sure to call our office to sign up if you're interested in attending more of those classes. So with that, I'm going to unshare and I'm going to stop recording for this class.